Hello everyone, we're here for episode 9 of the Exodus seminar, and we're going to pick up the story where Moses comes down the mountain with the commandments that have been delivered to him by Yahweh. And after escaping from the tyranny in Egypt, and after traversing at least a good part of the desert, after putting up with the trouble both of tyranny, let's say, and excess, licentious and aimless freedom, the fundamental structure of the rules by which people are oriented, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, are about to be made explicit. And so that's where we pick up today. And for us, we're going to start with Exodus 19, which I'll read. And if anybody wants to chime in at any time with some additional thoughts, that's fine. But then we'll move to Exodus 20, and I'll just go through the commandments, and I'll go through them, and then I'll go back to the beginning, and we'll start discussing. Are we all ready to go? Exodus 19. Yeah, well, yes, and thank you all very much once again for returning. And man, let's see if we can knock it out of the park carefully. So, in the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai, for they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness. And there Israel camped before the mount. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now, therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people.
Okay, forgive me.
Yes.
I wanted to keep quiet, but this is too...
That's not going to happen.
Yes, I try, though. I want everyone to know I try.
I wanted to make a comment earlier, too. So.
Really? This is of extreme importance in my view. If you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession. So one of the most controversial things I have said in my career is that I don't believe in unconditional love. This is one of my biblical bases. If you keep my covenant, you are my treasured people. If you don't, you're not.
Right.
That's conditional.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things we could investigate on that front is whether or not love in any real sense can be unconditional. Right? Because if the love is unconditional, it doesn't have an element of encouragement towards an ideal. There's nothing that's discriminating and judgmental in the way that's elevating, because everything you do is instantly, well, it's all loved. And it seems to me that there's a tension there between what you might describe as the archetype of feminine love and the archetype of masculine love. And feminine love is love for an infant. It's all encompassing. And masculine love, you could say, is, well, it's got that conditional element whose design is to further growth in some sense. So, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Right, banging home that point. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people, and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the 3rd day. For the 3rd day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourself, that ye not go up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever touches the mount shall surely be put to death. There shall not a hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through. Whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. And people went down from the mount unto the people, and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said unto the people, Be ready against the third day. Come not at your wives. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount. And the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. What do you think of that that issue of perishing there, Jonathan? So it's repeated multiple times in this part of the story, and it reminds me also of other sections that talk about, I think God only allows Moses to see his back and not his face because it would be too destructive. And there are later references to the potential for death to occur if people touch the Ark of the Covenant. It's something like, beware of touching anything that's deep and sacred, because it's so, what would you say? It's dangerous to too carelessly approach that which is most fundamental. I mean, that's certainly the case in life. So,
yeah, I think so. But I think there's also something else going on. We talked about this a little bit last time, which is that in some ways, many of the iterations of the story until now show us that God is in some ways too high at this point. That is, God has forgotten Israel. Israel are scattered. They don't have cohesion. They're not a nation. They're not coming together. And so now we come to the mountain, and you have a dramatic representation of that. God is up above, up in the mountain, the trumpet, the music of the spheres. You hear, he's the pattern of everything. He's the source of all things. And then he says, put a boundary around the mountain. Nobody should come in, because until there is mediation between God and the world, God will swallow up the world. And you can understand it. You can understand it at a lower level. I mean, obviously, this is talking about all of reality, but you can understand that, if you have a goal and you don't have mediations towards that goal, it actually will just be a judge that will break everything. Mm-hmm. So if I tell you jump 1,000 feet, that's it. That's the goal for you, and then it'll just crush you because you can't. But if I give you a bunch of ways to do it, and I put mediations between the ideal and how it manifests itself in the world, then it can exist. Well, but this is the ultimate version of that.
Yeah,
this is obviously...
Okay. Well, you see this in psychotherapy. I mean, one of the signal contributions of behaviorists to the practice of psychotherapy was the notion of what would you call them? Incremental strategies. So a behaviorist principle is, imagine that we had jointly strategized so that you were aiming at something. Maybe you're unemployed and you're aiming at getting your CV together to get a job. And what we do then is, so the ideal is for you to be fully employed, and now you've even bought into that ideal. So it's an ideal that you're willing to accept as an orienting structure. And then you find that you don't do it, and you come back the next week to therapy and you say, I'm so ashamed, I was supposed to submit my CV to like 10 potential employers this week, and I did nothing at all. And so the first thing you do in that situation is you say, well, we should lower the goalposts. We should lower the goal. We say, well, you couldn't submit your CV to 10 employers. Could you even open it on your computer? Because people are often afraid to even do that because, your CV contains well, maybe the record of your successes, but also the record of your failures. And so you scale down the goal until it no longer has that face of the harsh judge that will destroy. And that's part of building those intermediary structures. And it seems to me that that's part of what's signaled in the idea of subsidiarity and the building of these. And that's I think you made reference earlier in one of the other sessions to the idea that that subsidiary structure was like Jacob's ladder. It's a hierarchy that reaches up to the heavens, to the highest point, that puts incremental layers in place so that that's not a judge that's so harsh that you just die when you're judged.
And it also lays it out. So when we get to the law, we're going to get there. When you get to the law, you'll see it's the same thing. God says, first he says, I am God, I am the source of all things, you know, you can't put anything in front of me. And then after that, it kind of comes down, then he gives you some moral principles, but even those, like thou shalt not kill. Okay, what does that mean? And then then it starts to unpack. And all the rest of the laws are unpacking and making specific something which is held together in a higher state, you could say, or a more contained space in the first part of the law. So the way the law is going to lay itself out is actually the same as just the basic structure of God on the mountain and saying, you know, it's like, okay, we're going to start, you know, how do we do this? Bring Moses up and now slowly lay out what that means.
Well, so you could view, please go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to change the point slightly, if so you.
Okay, well, so what we see happening up to this point in the biblical corpus, I've understood this more since we've had our discussions, is that you're seeing the nature of the spirit that unites socially and psychologically be explored using a variety of different narrative approaches. So you have the God that is that spirit that you walk unself-consciously with in a perfect garden, right? Say when you're abiding by yourself appropriately, and then you have the God in the story of Cain and Abel that judges you when you make improper sacrifices, and you have the God that calls you to protect your community when storms beckon. And it's metonymy, right? It's the juxtaposition of these stories to flesh out the idea that all these spirits unite in some unified and transcendent spirit. But then you have the problem is that unified and transcendent spirit can become so abstract that it's incomprehensible. That's the Deus abscondus problem that Mircea Eliade talked about, the potential for God to become just a spiritual abstraction and then to disappear into space. And then you have the other problem is that if God, the spirit that guides us, is conceptualized as the union of all possible virtues, then it also becomes a judge that's so harsh that no one can bear its judgment. So that brings up the problem of differentiation. And that's, you said, that's partly what's being, and God has to descend onto the mountain too before he can talk to Moses. So he has to take himself down a peg or two in some sense, I suppose, to make himself acceptable and understandable to human beings.
I was going to change it slightly, but so many people look at the Ten Commandments as central to the whole of Exodus, but actually I think the covenant in chapter 19 is even more central, and the Ten Commandments is the key part of it. But I say that because here we're in a country, this is the master narrative of freedom that has shaped this country. And many people don't understand the links. So I was fascinated, Leon Cass, who's a friend of several of us, he points out, you know, the Greeks had monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. They sort of run through all three of those. So Pharaoh is monarchy, ultimate tyranny. But when Moses is the sole leader, he's a kind of good Pharaoh. And Jethro says to him, no, you can't do it all yourself. But Jethro, in effect, introduces an aristocracy. You choose these good men to be the judge. Now, the covenant is quite different. It will bring in the entire people. And you have a very different idea
And it's
here.
a contractual relationship.
It's a contractual relationship, but unlike the Hittite covenants, the whole people, all that the Lord says we will do, that's the origin of the consent of the governed.
Right. Well, and that seems to tie into the notion that was relevant to, well, even people like John Stuart Mill, like founders of classical liberalism in some sense, that the the arrangements by which a free people might organize themselves politically and trade are dependent axiomatically on an underlying ethos. And that ethos is essentially covenantal, it's contractual. And that also ties into something else we discussed earlier, which was the idea that when God revealed himself as the spirit that judged the tyrant, and he told Moses to tell the Pharaoh to let his people go, he didn't say, let my people go. He said, let my people go so that they may worship me in the desert. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea of ordered freedom instead of freedom as chaos, which is just the desert. Mm-hmm. So, so.
God seems to need a people, right? Exodus is about the founding of a people. What do you need to make a people? In this story, they have a story. They were in bondage and they got let out. It's a heroic story, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's a covenant. I make you a promise, you make me a promise. And then the last thing is, what happens in this book is he gives them a bunch of things to do together to celebrate their new relationship with each other and with God. And that, so the rituals are vital because they can be the people, my people. And then they can remain a treasure to him.
Mm-hmm. How do you view, Larry, the relationship between the idea of a covenant with God and the idea of a contractual relationship and the later political ideas of social contract theory that people like Hobbes developed, that what binds us is actually a voluntary contract between people? That's not exactly what we're saying. There's a voluntary contract between people, but it's people in relationship to a higher revealed order. It's not merely a social contract. And so
in the American Revolution, first of all, those are two different things: contract with God and contract with one another, but they merge. And so when they're working out what they're going to do about the king and about the parliament, they're saying, we don't have a contract with him. And contract law, grandly understood, governs God's governance of the universe. It's wrong for him to do that. God doesn't. Because see, God has chosen to make his people free, right? And that means they have to be a party to the transaction.
Right.